OK，今天是咱们的座谈会，然后上个月的座谈会，小马也跟大家说了嘛，就是咱们座谈会呢也可以尝试带大家看一看国外最新的这些教学视频，看看这种形式会不会对大家能有所帮助。然后大家看我们那个咱们千算最近 B 站号上面发的说，在跟 GTO Wizard 的合作，做一些训练器啊之类的这些方面的工作嘛。然后他们这边呢，这一个训练的网页上面还有一个隐藏的东西，就是这个 weekly course，就是GTO Wizard 教练会每周在这儿给大家上一节课，然后他这一节课呢是1个小时左右。然后并不是那种准备成 PPT 的格式，就是每一次分享一个点，就开着 GTO Wizard 呀，或者开着那个 Pilsover，给大家讲一些例子。然后呢，它这个里面所讲到的一些牌力也好，就是说打牌的思路也好，然后一些阶段性的结论也好，都是挺不错的。然后今天呢，我就带大家一起看一下它在这个网站上线的时候就发布的第一个视频。就是它标题是广大玩家犯的最多的5个错误，然后它分了5期视频来写，然后咱们今天先来看其中的一个。呃，我现在这边共享一下那个电脑的声音，然后我把自己的麦静音掉，然后大家一会儿在那个公屏里打字说一下，就是说如果说没啥问题的话，咱们就这样放，就是放的过程中你们应该是能够听到这边那个电脑里面的声音的。
And we're going to be able to take a look into some spots where we're going to see what we can improve and learn from this depolarization concept. Okay, so again, you guys are going to see that there are a lot of spots where you should be playing depolarized strategies, or in other words, strategies that include a lot of small betting, strategies that are not necessarily just based on you checking most of your range and then betting good hands and betting bluffs. Okay, so you're going to see that this happens very, very often on the solver. And population really, like most people are not even aware that.
不是，是这样，在这里边呢是网页里边嵌套的一些视频，这个视频是没有字幕的。然后南师老师帮咱们下载下来，然后下载过，然后下载完之后呢上传 YouTube，可以自动生成字幕。就是这个也是一个小技巧，大家如果说看国外的视频没有字幕的啃不动的话，你想办法网页上装个插件把它下载下来。如果不会装的话，最原始的方法你就自己开个那个腾讯会议。把这个视频录下来，录完之后上传到 YouTube，自己这块儿在自己频道里边上传进去，隔个大概1天左右吧，就所有英文的它都能自动给生成一个字幕出来。这也是一个就是学习国外视频的小技巧，就没有字幕的可以用 YouTube 去自动生成。然后这一节里边它讲的是一个depolarized strategy，就是一个非极化的一个策略。之前这边在给大家讲课的时候，更多的是强调就是说番前照着表打，翻牌打尽量 GTO 一点，然后翻牌呢就转牌呢尽量别犯极化错误，就是说转牌要让大家打的极化一点，下注的是尽量好的牌，还有那个摊牌价值比较低的牌，要么纯炸胡，要么是听牌嘛，对吧？然后这里边呢，这节课他讲到的呢，就是说在 OPA 的时候2种场景，一种是小盲 vs 大盲的 single result，还有呢是3bet 炮 OPA，我们小盲3B button 这2种情景下的 turn，在有些时候是应该采取一个非极化的一个策略的，就是说我们应该拿大多数牌，就像翻牌100%C bet 一样，应该拿大部分的中强牌打一个小注，这是广大玩家也都会犯的一个错误。当然，这也是可能咱们跟着千算的系统学下来以后，大家也都是没有注意到的一个点吧。然后大家可以看一下，它这里边举到2个例子，一个是 single result 的小盲 vs 大盲，另一个是3bet 炮的小盲 vs button。OK，
This is a thing in theory, and the ones that do might even struggle to implement it. So that's why it's so important to have this in our game. Last week we discussed a a double barrel spot in a 3-bet pot out of position. And you guys are going to see that most of the examples are going to be when we're playing out of position. Okay, because when you're playing out of position, the way to realize your equity usually goes through having small bets in your range. And as we go forward, you guys are going to increase your understanding of why that's the case. I have here another example of spot where this happens a lot, which is playing small blind versus big blind. Okay, so here we have a ace 10-6 board. And well, we opened from the small blind, we got called from the big blind, and we got the board ace 10-6. Right, so let's go back to the flop to see the strategy. You're already going to see this depolarization on the flop, but usually the field is already aware of how depolarization happens on the flop. We see here that it wouldn't make sense for you to just bet ace jack plus and then check the rest. We play a very deep polar strategy on the flop already with very high frequency of bets and only 20% of checks in our range. Okay, so this is a deep polar strategy. You're betting pretty much every single hand class in your range for a small size. But flop is much more intuitive for people, or if not intuitive, it's much more common to see deep polar strategies on the flop from population. So you have this flop, you bet, your opponent's going to have a certain response, which we're not going to get into much today because it's not the point, not the topic, but we're going to see very little folding. Of course, you're betting very small. If villain starts to fold too much, he increases the EV of your bets, so he needs to float a lot. He's going to have to develop some raises, otherwise you're also going to have your EV increased. He doesn't punish you with raises, so you get to bet any two cards. And then after he calls, imagine you get a jack turn. So I picked exactly this turn because I feel like this is one in which a lot of people would default to a much more passive strategy than what the solver uses. Let's take a look at the chat here. King 9 off, David said. Not sure what you mean, David. And we have this strategy. So take a look at this. On the jack turn, the out of position player is checking 42% of the range and block betting again with 35% of the range. So 35% of the range is included in the block sizing again. And we also have a portion of the range that goes into the overbet sizing. And if we take a look at the hands that go into the block sizing, we see hands that most people are going to be very uncomfortable in betting against the pot. So you have a lot of jack X, some jack X even going purely into that betting range, and a lot of 10x. So a hand even weak as a 10 or even as a 6 is going again into the block bet sizing. King 9, check on the flop. Okay. So, all right, I want you guys to help me here. Why do you think this is happening? Why are we betting so much on this jack with hands as weak as a 10, as a jack, sometimes even as a 6? What are the possible hypotheses here of why this should be the correct equilibrium strategy for that opposition player? Again, if you want to unmute yourself and talk, that's totally fine. If you guys want to interact more through the chat, I know this is the preferred option for most people. Feel free as well. Vinicius Gonçalves said to realize our equity more in a nice price. André said the big blind wide continuous range. Kish, I'm sorry, man. I'm going to fuck up your name a lot here because very hard one. I'm going to call you by your last name, Dingra. Ranges are still very wide. All right, what else? Because we have more nutted hands, equity advantage. Okay. Charlie Sutton said we have more jack X on the turn than villain, therefore we have an advantage in the middle of the range. Nice.
Also, maybe because we are blocking sets and we can realize our equity and we have more outs.
What do you mean we're blocking sets? Which hands are blocking sets?
6x, 10x.
Okay, 6x, 10x. Well, villain shouldn't really have 10s, right? Because he just called pre-flop. But yes, 6x is blocking pocket 6s. Dung said, I think small blind have more 2-pair straight set on jack on this board. Right. Most combo 3-bet, most combo big blind 3-bet on pre-flop. That is correct. So most of you have answered parts of the answer that are going to compose why this is the strategy. And it was funny, as I was thinking about the class today, I came up with some funny analogies of why this happens in theory, and not necessarily why this happens in theory, because it obviously doesn't explain, but it can be a fun analogy that I'm going to get into in a minute. But most of your answers are correct in a sense that on this triple Broadway texture, for sure the small blind is going to have a significant advantage in both the middling equity hands and the top end of the range. So you guys can use the ranges tab here on GTO Wizard to check how the different parts of both ranges are interacting on this board. And I really like to use the equity distribution graph. Okay, so if most of you guys are not still using randomization in your games, I would assume you're also not using very much the equity distribution graph. So I would encourage you to use this tool whenever you're studying, because it gives you a pretty clear picture of how both ranges are interacting into that given board texture. Okay, so basically what this graph is going to show is in the horizontal axis here, it shows the percentile of hands in the range. So let me try to move this here. Or maybe I'm just going to minimize it. Yeah, just going to minimize it. So in the horizontal axis, you have the percentile of hands. So from this point to the left, we have 50% of the range. If you go more through here, you can, let's say, have 75% of the range. So you just have the proportion of hands in the range. And in the vertical axis, you have the equity of those hands. Okay, so for example, for the big blind here, which is the green line, by taking a look at this graph, we know already that 50% of the big blind's range has less than 50% equity. Okay, so we get to know by looking at this graph, and even less than 50%. So this region here, which we can't know exactly, well, we can't because it's the queen 6 off. It has 40%. So half of the big blind's range has 40% equity or less. Okay, and then you can compare the different regions of both ranges to see which range has.
OK，那个为了照顾一下，就是咱们可能有些同学虽然有英文字幕，可能看起来也不是那么好理解。咱们每放一会儿会停下来给大家简要的总结一下刚才都讲了啥。刚才这手牌呢，它是讲了一个那个小盲 vs 大盲的例子。小盲 open 3BB，稍等一下，我选一下跟它一样的那个。小盲 open 3BB， 大盲 call。然后是一个 AT3的 Rainbow 的牌面在这个牌面上呢，小盲会选择高频的 C bet， 然后大盲 call，在发了一张第4种颜色的勾之后，然后这个时候等它弹出来。25那个吧。basic 是这个 bet call 看花色。AT6 AT6 bet 25 call 草花钩。OK，这个地方 Sower 给出来的结论呢，就是说有很多违背大家直觉的东西，就是 整体的频率上面会有42%的 check，有35%的去选择继续打小注 ，flop 打了一个1/4，turn 上又是一个1/4，一个 blocking bet。然后呢，除了小注之外，另外的就会选择一个150%的一个极化的范围，一个极化的 size。然后选择这个 blocking bet 的这个手牌，包括几乎所有的弱的勾叉，然后一部分的 T 叉，甚至还有一些6叉的小踢脚。这些牌都会在转牌进行一个 blocking bet，这就是他这节课里边所要讲到的一个非极化的策略。为什么会产生这样的一个结果呢？就是他用了这里边这个equity 曲线这个里边给大家展示。这个曲线大家看 GTO 已经看过无数次了，就不需要给大家解释太多了。然后呢，它里边有一个关注的点比较有意思，就是横坐标轴就是它各个组合嘛。这如果放到50这儿可以看到，小盲的就是最差的不叫最差的50%吧，就是正好处在中间的一手牌是90方片，就是说在小盲的这个范围里边有一半牌比90方片更好，一半比90方片更差。那它处于就管它叫中位数吧，就中位数的这个牌呢，小盲是有54%的 equity 的，而大盲作为防守方，虽然 flop 也弃了一些牌，虽然面对1/4他弃的很少，也弃了一些最差的牌，弃过一些牌之后，在 turn 发完勾，那大盲范围里边，牌力正好处在一半的一手牌是圈6，它只有41%的 equity，也就是说，在强牌和中强牌这两部分里面，小盲的 equity 就是小盲是压制大盲防守方的，也就是这个 equity 曲线里边可以看到，这蓝色的在过了1/3以后，就是右半段都是在这个防守方上面的，这个呢就导致了因为既有 equity 优势又有 nut 优势，就导致了小盲可以继续用大量的这种中程牌做一个blocking bet，也就是这种非极化的策略。OK，继续往下看。
These lines on the graph, some part of the lines are differently. It means that the range is different in some part, and you can study exactly in which part these ranges are different. And we see that here on the middle of the range, we see that the small blind here, which is the blue line, most of the hands that have middling equity have higher equity in the small blinds range. So we see that from here, which would be maybe something like 30, from 35 percentile to something like 70. So that's around 35% of the range. So 35% of both ranges are middling strength hands, and those middling strength hands are stronger in the small blinds range. Okay, so the small blind is probably going to have stronger Jack X combos. The small blind is going to have a higher concentration of ace X combos because the big blind 3-bets some ace X pre-flop, 3-bets some sort of Broadway's pre-flop. So we see that the small blind has way more middling hands, or not necessarily way more, but all of those middling hands have higher equity than the middling hands of the big blind. Okay, and the big blind is just going to have more weaker bluff catchers that the small blind is not going to have. So someone I think said this in the chat. So the small blind does have more middling hands, and the small blind also has more equity in the top end of the range. So if we isolate the top 25% of hands, we see that all hands in the small blinds range has more equity than the top hands of the big blinds range. This simply means that the strongest two pairs in the small blinds range are going to have more equity than the two pairs and sets of the big blinds, because the small blind obviously has the jacks, tens, aces, which big blind never has, and the small blind also has higher two pairs that the big blind doesn't have all that much. So for example, a hand like ace jack is going to be 3-betting a lot pre-flop, whereas the small blind is going to have 100%. Okay, so by just looking at this graph, I know that the small blinds range is stronger, and I know that the small blinds range contains a lot of middling hands that want to bet, that want to obviously bet small. So it's not going to be surprising.
Quick question, sorry.
Go ahead.
Does it mean that on a high card board, like for example 3 Broadways like this one, it means that on the right side of the graph, if they are more separated, it means that one range is stronger to play that board, or it's only, we're talking about only ranges?
Can you rephrase that? Not sure I fully
For
got
example,
what you.
Can you open the graph?
Yeah.
Yeah. For example, on a middle boards, for example, I don't know, if you see this graph, you see that on the middle side they are more separated. Can you tell, is the assumption correct? Like if you say that in the middle boards you would be stronger?
What do you mean middle board? Related to
Only range. I thought
the small betting range being composed of mostly the middling straight hands. So we see here a lot of Jack X, we see a lot of 10X, and then some weakish ace X going into that range as well. But as someone asked me in the chat and I answered, it's not going to be a very strong strategy if you only bet Jack X and 10X or weak ace X for the sizing, right? Because villain could still have very strong hands such as King Queen, Ace Jack, Ace 10. So if you play a strategy where you only bet small with these Jack X, 10X combos, you will be in trouble, of course, against a GTO player. Against population is another story. For example, if you play a very exploitable strategy, it's not necessarily true that everyone will exploit you and start raising you very thin, okay? But since we are here talking about GTO, that's where we're gonna focus. So it can't be a very strong strategy for you to only bet with these hands. So that strategy is going to have to include some very strong hands in it as well. And then we can start talking about some heuristics that you can use of where to put certain strong hands in which part of your range. Okay, so I'm going to make a question to you guys. Why is it that the solver is always betting big or checking with sixes and always betting small or checking with aces? Give me hypothesis of why this is happening here. So Brian said sixes doesn't block the call range. Sixes unblocking top pair, aces blocking top pair. Sixes not block the top of big blind's range. Right, what else? Aces block ace X call. Very nice. So you guys already have a very strong heuristic that you can use to construct strategies. Okay, so if you have to decide between checking, betting big, and bet small, one of the first things you have to ask yourself is, does my combo block my opponent's calling range? So size, because you would be blocking a lot of your opponent's continuing range. So you see that solver will never size up with aces. With pocket sixes, on the other hand, you completely unblock all the Broadway region that is going to call you when you size up. So therefore, you don't block those calls. Okay, so first thing you have to think about is blockers to the calling range. Now, what other strong hands we have here? We have pocket jacks. So pocket jacks we can see is mixing between all options, but almost never checking. And we have a hand like ace king that is pure betting with the bigger size. So the same things are going to apply to these other combos, right? So ace king is a hand that it doesn't have great equity at this point anymore because it loses to some two pair. But having the king is very good because you block the nuts, which would be king queen. So this, and you still dominate a lot of the calls that villain is going to have in his range. When you have a hand like jacks, for example, you could block bet, you could size up, and you could also check because the blockers are not necessarily detrimental to any action that you take. If you block bet with a very good hand, one important thing you have to think about is whether you block raises, okay? Because a lot of the time, if you have a very strong hand, you want to get raised when you bet small. And with jacks, yes, to block ace jack, but villain still has all the pocket sixes, ace 10 that he can raise, so it's not that big of a deal. And with the checking range, you're mostly going to have to think about hands that block your opponent's check behinds. Okay, so we see here that aces and sixes are decent hands to put in the check range sometimes, and you're going to see that this is because villain is going to have a lot of those hands in his check back range. So if we take a look here, which hands villain checks when
OK，那刚才这段呢，就是刚才那个学生的提问，我跳过去了，就是他问中间那一段，小盲比大盲线要高一些，是不是在一些中章的牌面上面，会是这样？这个就是说对这个XT 曲线理解错误的嘛？这个 XT 曲线呢本身讲的就只是这一个牌面上的，在这一个牌面上面，横坐标是不同的组合，然后纵坐标呢是这个组合面对对方整个范围的 equity， 这个 GTO 大家看的都比较熟了，然后这个印度同学提问就跳过去了。然后后面呢视频里边讲到了，就是说如果你在 turn 主要的策略是3个 check bet small and bet large， 那你这3个范围里边站在 GTO 的角度都应该有强牌作为保护。对吧？如果说当然你面对玩家池，你某一个范围里边没有 NAS 保护，不会被剥削，那是另一回事儿。但是站在 GTO 的角度呢，你就是需要把自己的强牌做一个区分，究竟哪些强牌是放到下大注的里边，哪些是放到下小注，哪些是放到过牌里面。这个里边他就重点讲了4手牌，66、AA 和 AK， 这4个格呢都是 equity 比较强的，就是 equity 在80以上的手牌。那66呢，它是放在下大注的这个里边来了，就是因为66并不阻挡防守方能够跟住大注的大量的2对儿，然后以及带队的听牌。然后 AA 呢是阻挡了对手跟注的范围的，所以 AA 呢就是被拆到了保护过牌范围和保护下小注的范围里面。然后 AK 这手牌虽然它的绝对牌力并没有3条甚至2对那么强，但是呢它的本身的 equity 有足够高，也有80头的 equity， 同时它是阻挡了 NAS， 就是阻挡了 IP 防守的那个全 K 的 NAS 嘛。同时，他在下大注的时候面对的 raise 是最少的。我们可以点来看一下，就是面对不同的 size，IP 正确的 raise 应该是多少？就是面对这个 1.5 倍的超持 ，IP 只会选择 cover fold， 是不会选择 raise 的。而面对这个28%的这个1/4的尺度呢 ，IP 应该要 raise 14%左右，加起来2个不同的 size。然后其实玩家池是 raise 不了这么多的嘛。就刚才这一段，它主要讲了，就是在你需要把自己的范围拆分成2部分甚至3部分的时候，你是怎样把自己的强牌分别分配到这几个范围里边的？就是需要考虑一些 blocker 的效应。没有 block 对手继续的跟注范围的，可以放到下注和尤其是下大注的范围里面；阻挡对手那个跟注范围的，放到下小注和过牌的范围里面去。然后 AK 这种本身 equity 不错，但并不是最顶尖的，但是呢，同时 block 了对手的NAS 的这些牌，也可以放到下大注的里边去。也就是说，我们 bet 超持的这个范围里面，并不是除了 NAS 就是就是空气了。你看这 AK A 圈这些手牌也都足够强到去打一个超持了。这个东西呢，也涉及到一个就是前段时间在另一个视频里边看到的一个概念，就是所谓极化程度。你打的极化程度越强，就是你 size 越大，就代表了你极化程度越强；你 size 越小呢，代表了你极化程度越弱。那玩家，咱们人类玩家跟 PAL 差距比较大的呢，就是可能会人为的把这种极化的 size 所对应的极化程度想的特别过分。就比如说，打超持，要么就 set， 要么就空气了。可能 A6 或者说可能60同花都不想打超持，都感觉不够极化。但是实际上并不是的。用来打超持的手牌，你看AK A 圈都已经足够好了。这些手牌的 equity 呢，应该是在80左右吧？看一下，86，都是86左右的这些手牌，已经足够支持去做一个在补力位置做一个超持的 turn 的下注了。OK， 这是刚才这部分，咱们继续。
you check, a lot of them are going to contain a 6. So all of this here, 6, 6, 6, 6, and a lot of low ace-X as well are going to be in the checking range. So these 3 things you have to consider: blockers to your opponent's calling range, blockers to your opponent's raising range if you have a very strong hand that wants to induce raises, and blockers to check back. If you keep these 3 things in mind, you're going to be able to make some very decent range constructions, even though you might not get the frequencies right off the bat, of course. At least you're not going to make the mistake of sizing up with aces or sizing down with 6s, okay? Because that would be bad. So you don't want to pick strategies that are lower EV. So here, if you try to size down with 6s, you're going to lose 0.3 of a big blind. If you try to size up with aces, you also lose 0.3 of a big blind. Okay. Let's see the chat. Ace King is most aggressive value because only 1 card blocks value. Yeah, this is still very strong. Yes, it doesn't block some of your opponent's calls, so it can still retain equity against calling range for sure. Okay, so first thing I want to address here, always think about blockers to calling range, blockers to check back range, and blockers to raising range. Now, as we were talking about before, imagine you play a strategy where you have those heuristics, but you never randomize. So you always bet small with aces, you always bet big with 6s, and the others you pick whatever you feel like in the moment. This will obviously make you exploitable, okay? Because you're going to lack very strong hands in your checking range. Every time you check, you have 7s, 8s, 9s, and some sort of 6x. Okay, so against a very strong opponent, you would become very exploitable, even though you're not making any VIM mistake against a GTO opponent, because since it's a mixed strategy, checking and betting small with aces has the same EV, betting big and checking with 6s has the same EV. But against an observant opponent that knows you're just always fast playing these hands, always betting small with aces, always betting big with 6s, whenever you check, they can just place very big bets. Okay, so of course, the first step is to understand the heuristics, but obviously if you want to play very accurately, you're going to have to find some randomizing, all right? So this is the first example here, and now I can get into the analogy. When you want to think about when to depolarize your strategies, I was thinking about, imagine you are friends with Neymar, right? Neymar, professional footballer, and you want to get into a party. Why are you still block betting some 6x but never 7s and 9s? That's a good question from Rafael here. So one argument that Juan used, I forgot your name. So blocking raises will be very important, right? So you don't want to get raised when you're betting with this a middling strength hand. So if you have a middling strength hand that blocks your opponent's raises, it makes it higher EV for you to block. Okay, and also you don't want to block folds. Okay, so if we take a look at the folds, probably villain is going to have some folds that we're blocking with those hands. So let's take a look here. Yeah, so for example, if you have those hands, you're going to be blocking this region of folds. And villain is not going to fold any 6x, of course. And he's going to raise you with some 6x as well. He's going to raise you with Jack 6, Queen 6, and stuff like that. Okay, so whenever you can either unblock folds, unblock folds and block raises is going to increase the EV of your block bets. Right, so let me get back to the example. 6 checks and ties because it's hand block a lot, be blind check back. We want. Dung said 6s sometimes check because this hand block a lot, big blinds check back hand. We want big blind to bet, then check raise. Exactly. So you have 6s here, which is almost the nuts in a spot where villain never has any better set and can only have king queen that beats you, right? So you want to put money into the pot with 6s. So if you're going to have a checking hand that is very strong, you want that checking hand to induce bets, and you induce bets by blocking your opponent's check behind range. Okay, so if you block your opponent's check behinds, you increase the frequency with which he will bet into you, and that increases the EV of checking. Okay, so that's what we're gonna do there with sixes sometimes. And you need to have some very strong hands in our checking range, otherwise you become capped and exploitable. Okay. But as I was talking, the analogy, imagine you want to get into a party and you're friends with Neymar. If you get to the club, no staff is going to prevent you from entering because you're friends with Neymar, right? You just say, hey, I'm with Ney and I want to get in, and you're going to get in. Even if you're a nobody, even if you haven't paid to enter the club, you're going to enter the club. So this is what's going to happen here with ranges. If you have a middling strength hand that can be accompanied by some very strong hands, you are allowed, or you are capable of realizing your equity by betting because of that. Okay, so here you have a very strong range that allows your middling strength hands to realize equity by betting. If you would make a situation here, or simulate a situation where you lack all these strong hands, then you would see Jack X and 10X going straight into the checking range. All right. Nice one. Love the analogy. Thanks. I also saw some, I was reading a book. I don't remember when I was, which book it was. I think it was Thinking Fast and Slow. And in that book, I think he was in that book, he comments on an interesting psychological effect of how people rate attractiveness of other people when they're in a group compared to when they are alone. So if you take a random group of beautiful women, for example, and you put some not very beautiful women in that group, and you ask people to rate the attractiveness of all the women, the not very attractive women will get higher rates when they're in the picture with the group compared to when they are alone. So again, you increase your value when you are accompanied by high value people or attractive people. And this is what's going to happen here. These hands have their EV increased when they are accompanied by some other very strong hands, because your opponent can't really fight back too much. Your opponent can't really go crazy and start raising you when you bet with the jack, because you are protected with these very strong hands. Okay, so you can use this analogy to remember when to use these bets, right? So this is the first example. And again, I wanted to highlight the blocker effects here in the strategies. White 10-6 suited bets more than Jack 6. Let's take a look here. So 10-6 is betting, and 10-6 is mostly sizing up. Jack 6 is mostly sizing down. So they're both betting very often, right? So 10-6 and Jack 6 are both betting very often. Probably you want to size up more with 10-6 because you block less of the calling range. So villain should probably continue more often with an ace and a jack compared to a 10. So with the 10-6, you unblock more of the calling range. Talking about contrast in the influence book, and I don't think it was that book. I don't think it was. I'm pretty sure it was Thinking Fast and Slow, that people tend to rate other people higher in attractiveness when in a group compared to when they are alone. All right, so now we can move on to the second example. This one is the same.
OK， 刚才这部分呢，它讲了就是这些选择 blocking bet 的手牌，之所以在这手牌里边选择下注比 check 的 EV 更高，是因为在下注的范围里面，除了这些牌，还有 AAKK 圈圈，然后以及其他的这些两对之类的强牌，也就是所谓狐假虎威的意思了。就是当你的范围里面有足够多的强 equity 或者 NAS 牌的时候，你的这些中强牌 bet 出去的 EV 更高。原因就是说你范围里面有那些强牌，你就会更少的被 raise。就是在这个里边可以看到，就是 IP 的 equity 没有那么强的时候，它也需要面对小注 raise 13%。刚才那个展示过，就是切过去面对这个28的double barrel， 它是需要 raise 13%左右的频率。然后呢，如果说 OPA 的 equity 优势没有那么明显，那再去下小注的话 ，IP 的 raise 频率甚至会到20以上。那这些中强牌去下注，然后被高频的 raise，它的 EV 就会损失很多。这些牌打出去之所以能够实现较高的 EV，是因为它的整体范围比较强，然后 IP 呢raise 的频率没有那么高。那这个东西呢，在实践中的价值是更高的，因为玩家其实 raise 不出来这么多的，就是在这种我们有优势的牌面下，他们是 raise 不出来13的频率的，就是在那些我们没有优势的牌面下，他们也更 raise 不出来，就是说20-30%那样的一个 raise 的频率的。然后这样，刚才还说啥来着？最后还有个啥？最后他说那个有一个学员问为啥勾6是打小的，然后16是打大的？这个就是说，他说应该是 IP 面对这个大 size 会弃掉时差，但是会防守勾差，所以说16不阻挡对手面对150%超持跟住的勾差，所以16是放到这个超持这个 size 里边，然后勾6呢是阻挡对手的勾差，然后 check 掉嘛。我们来验证一下这个事儿啊。就是看看面对150%究竟是不是勾差要大部分防守，然后 T 差要大部分 fold 掉。看这儿吧，这里 second pair 勾差会防守pair 加 draw 面对超持，然后 T 差跟它是一样的喽。但是占比会有一些区别，就是虽然都是去防守 pair 加 draw，可以从这看到，就是哎呀点错了，时差和勾差都是防守pair 加 gutter，但是呢可以从下边这个图里边能看出，就是 call 的勾差在所有勾差中的占比会高一些，当然这个就有一点强行解释的意味了，就是会多少有一些这样的 blocker 的效应的影响，就导致勾6是放到了打小注的范围里面 ，T6是放到打大注的那个范围里面了。然后这块也能够找到一个防守的边界值吧，就是面对150的超持，时差和勾差带 NAS 卡顺的，这里是都要防守的。
Jack 6 are both an example. What was that book? I don't think it was. I'm pretty sure it was Thinking Fast and Slow. That people tend to rate other people higher in attractiveness when in a group compared to when they are alone. All right, so now we can move on to the second example. This one is the same spot, so small blind versus big blind, but a delayed c-bet example. You guys want to see more about the bluffs here? We can spend more time on the same if you guys want. I have 2 more examples prepared here, but we can spend some more time on this one if you want. So what are the hands that we're bluffing here with? So for example, with the small sizing, we're using some queen highs. We're mixing a lot of queen highs, not using many king highs. And we are, what else? We're bluffing some 9-7, some 8-7, and then some very low pocket pairs here like 3s and deuces. I think it's better we cover a bit of everything instead of going too deep into each board. Yeah, I think I like this a little bit more than just spending 1 hour in just one sim here. But as you guys know, we're just starting. We're going to keep hearing you guys feedback about the format you prefer, and we're going to keep improving to what you prefer the most. And that's how we're going to do. Second spot here is small blind versus big blind. And we get this 9-8-5 board, right? So now very, very different than the ace high board we just looked at. This 9-8-5 is one in which the small blind is not going to be allowed to see bet too much. In fact, we're checking 70% of our range here. We're still using the small bet size, but we're checking 70% of our range. In a spot where a villain is going to have a lot of straights, a lot of two pairs, basically any hand in his range is going to have some equity, right? It's very hard for any hand here to not have decent equity on this board. So we end up checking a lot. Then imagine you get the turn ace, right? I also see a lot of people playing way too polarized strategies on a turn like this. So we got the turn ace, which should be a very great card for your range. And because it is a very great card for your range, you get to play a lot of depolarized betting. So we have here 24% of block bets, 21% of 2/3 bets, and 20% of overbets. So very evenly distributed betting frequency across the different strategic options. And then we have 35% of checks. And then when you look at the block bet range, you see that you can get away with putting a small bet with a hand as weak as an 8 here. So if you have a hand like 8-6, you get to bet small sometimes. If you have a hand like 8-7, 10-8, so a lot of 8x going to that betting range, some 9x going to that betting range, and then you have some of the ace-x, and then some of the other very strong hands like pocket aces. I'm gonna take a look at the chat. David, can you show us big blind strat on the flop for this hand here, the stabbing range? This is the strategy, 55% of checks, not so much blocking, and then a lot of 2/3 and overbets. This is generally going to be the case on these connected boards that the big blind, both ranges are going to have way too much equity with overcards. You want to deny the equity to the overcards by sizing up a bit. So we have 55% of checks and then 45% of bets, including even some overbets, because the big blind has 7-6 off, but the small blind should never open pre-flop or should open very infrequently. So this should give him the ability to have some overbets in the spot. Okay. All right. Let's move. Let's go back to the turn. So this is a spot where you could be playing very, very polar, where there's no necessity for doing so. And you could be passing a lot of EV by doing that, because you just put yourself into bluff catch mode every single time, right? You check and then you put yourself in a spot where you're going to be facing polarized bets. That's exactly what the solver wants to avoid here. He wants to realize equity with these middling straight hands, paying a small price to see rivers and to see showdown, instead of putting himself in a spot where he's just going to check, and the big blind is going to either realize equity by checking behind, or putting your EV down to 0 by polarizing and making you have to bluff catch just to prevent him from bluffing too much. Okay, so generally when your range is very strong, again, imagine you're at the party with Neymar, you're with him, you're allowed to enter. There's nothing the villain can do to stop you. You are going to be able to bet with your middling straight hands. If he tries to stop you, if he tries to raise, if he tries to do something tricky, you are protected with the very strong hands that he doesn't have. So you have all the strong ace jack plus. You're going to have here a lot of 8s, 9s, 5s. You're going to have aces, of course, in your range, and you're going to have some 7-6 as well. So even if villain tries to get tricky, you are very well protected. Okay, so for example, betting hands like 9x, betting hands like 8x, even some block bets with pocket 7s happening here. Okay, so be aware of these strategies and don't play a very face-up strategy where you just polarize to ace jack plus and then just check all your middling hands. Okay, this is not going to be very good as you move up. Against strong players, you will struggle in these spots. And you make their lives more difficult as well, because this is going to be effective exactly because villain is going to he's going to have a very significant understanding of theory to not mess up with his defenses here. Okay, so against that block sizing, he's only allowed to fold 20% of his range, and he's needed to again come up with around 14% of raises. So where are these raises coming from? So a lot of mixed strategies here. A lot of random gut shots with a 6 and a 7. some pairs with pair plus blocker going to the raising range as well. These hands are going to be very powerful blocker bluffing hands in some runouts. So you see here 6-5 with the heart raising quite often, 8-7 raising decent amount. You're going to have some flush draws, of course, some combo draws, and then the ace-x plus region. So the weakest hand for value villain has to raise here is something like ace-8 for the bigger sizing, and then any ace for the smaller size. Okay, so you force your opponent to come up with these mixed strategies in order to at least make your strategy having the same EV as the solver, right? But the first moment he starts to miss these raises, all of your blocking bets are going. So make sure you put them in that tough situation in which they're going to have to float a lot. So first thing is they're not going to be allowed to fold much. So pretty much any pair here has to continue. Even a hand as weak as pocket fours has to continue here. Of course, any gutter, any other pair. And then what else here of weak hand? Yeah, basically that. Even a hand as weak as pocket threes with the heart here, he has to float sometimes. Let's go to the chat. Someone said, okay. Thank you, Martin, for your comment. Andres said, it seems that when we depolarize on the turn, it increases the river play complexity. Well, I would say not necessarily, but often it could be the case. So, but this is again something that I mentioned in the previous coaching, right? When you're studying poker, when you're trying to get better, you have two options. You either simplify your life so that you make less mistakes, or you embrace complexity so that you induce more mistakes in your opponents, because that's how you make money. You know, the amount of EV you have in poker is just the difference between the amount of mistakes you make compared to the amount of mistakes your opponents make. So in order to increase that gap, you can do both things. You can reduce the amount of mistakes you're making, or you can increase the amount of mistakes or try to induce more mistakes into your opponent's strategy. And as I said before, it really depends on, first of all, your maturity in terms of understanding of theory, the stage of your career, and also I would say a lot of it has to do with your mental performance. Are you going to really be so frustrated and overwhelmed if you try to embrace complexity? If that's the case, then obviously just go for try to simplify your life. All right. Option A is a weak sauce. Not sure what that means. What should we do if we block with weak 8x and facing raise on the turn? What do you guys think? So let's try to answer David's question here before taking a look at the sim. So what should we do if we block with 8x and villain raises us? Could you give some turn card examples where you wouldn't want to use blocker bets? Yes, we can get into that. Maybe not today, but certainly on another coach. Yeah, river can be tough, but it's also harder for villains to play to set guns. Exactly, right. So always remember that if it's difficult for you, it's very likely difficult for your opponents as well. I was talking about that today as I was coaching guys at BRPC, and we're talking about playing deep, right? And one of my students, it's even instructor for the team, Max. I think Max is here, and he said something like, yeah, you know, it's difficult to play deep, but no one really knows how to play. So it kind of evens out. You just have to try and play solid, and it's going to be good. Kaku said, usually there's delays. Solver doesn't follow its MDF, but seems on this ace turn, it folds around its MDF. Is this coincidence with the ace turn, or is it different on versatile position delays? Very advanced question here. I'm gonna try to answer it very quickly. But usually when you're before the river, all hands have equity. So villain really shouldn't try to make you indifferent with the MDF number, because no hand has really 0% equity. Okay, so it's in order for you to make other hands that have equity indifferent, you're going to have to fold above the threshold that we usually see with the MDF, because the MDF we usually see calculated for the river assumes that bluffs have 0% equity, but before the river, no bluffs have 0% equity. Okay, so indifference is never going to be at that threshold. Fold bluffs, then fold some value, which probably includes some 8x, said Charlie.
然后这里刚才他讲的一个东西，就是说跟这节课的主题不是特别相关，但是呢是一个 AK 圈 toy game 的一个数学原理，就是说，大家在看 forward 的弃牌的时候，会发现 flop 和 turn 几乎面对所有 size 全都是 overfold。比如说你 single result IPA C bet 1/3，几乎在所有牌面上的 OP check fold 都会高于25%。然后 turn 呢，面对不同的 size 也是同样的情况。这个原因呢，就是说，在 flop 和 turn 上面，几乎没有任何一手牌呢是零 equity 的。你在 AK 圈的 toy game 里边，你拿全部的 A 和部分的圈下注，那你的圈下注的时候是零 equity。然后呢，在很多现实的牌局中，在 river 一些炸胡牌也是零 equity 的。但是呢，在 flop 和 turn 的时候，你的炸胡牌的 equity 不是零，所以说你 bet 出去的 value 的那部分是 equity 很强的，然后混合了一些非零的那个非零 equity 的一些 bluff，所以呢，这就导致了防守一方是需要 overfold 一些，让你这个整体bet 的就是 bluff 的 EV 是大于零的，这是一个原因。然后还有一个原因就是它这节课里边没有提到，另外一节课里边有讲到过，就是你的 check EV 是不等于零的，就是你无论在 IP 还是在 OP，选择 bet 或 check 的时候，你本身 check 的 EV 并不是等于零，那它就是需要让你，就比如说吧，你的一手2/7在 turn 上边，你一部分牌选择了 check，一部分牌选择了 bet，对吧？那你 check 那部分牌呢，可能在 river 歪中一张2，然后去收档怎么着赢，也就是说2/7的 check EV 是大于零的，那也就是需要你的2/7在作为 bluff 打出去的时候，它 bluff 的 EV 也是大于零的，也就是需要作为防守一方是需要 overfold 嘛。然后 AK 圈 toy game 这个事情呢，就是你研究的越深，对扑克的理解就会越到位。然后呢，在你制定策略上面，就我自己的理解啊，就是你花一些时间去研究 AK 圈 toy game，然后去看它在翻牌和转牌上，或者说在双方的范围是非极化，不是 AK 圈。比如说你是A 圈10勾，对手是勾圈 K 3张牌，你是10勾 KA 4张牌等等，这种奇怪情况下的 AK 圈 toy game。这些事儿你理解的深刻之后呢，你就会上头，你就能够知道就是 equity 是怎样在双方的范围里边分布的，然后又怎样通过发公共牌产生了 equity shift，然后这筹码就底池的这1.5BB 究竟是怎么样分配的。这个当然是题外话了，这并不是他这节课讲到的重点，只是他刚才提到了一句，就是说在 flop 和 turn 的时候，你所有用来 bluff 的手牌本身 equity 并不是零，这也就导致了作为防守方是需要比 MDF 要多 fold 一些牌的。
Call combos that has the possibility to improve, said Frank. I'm at trying to simplify every spot and being afraid to embrace complexity is weak shit. I don't think it's weak shit, because I think it's very valid in certain parts of your development in your career. I would say that it's very common for people to sometimes even how can I put this into the right words? It's common to see people that are trying to bite more than they can chew, right? I think this is a saying in English, or take a bigger step larger than your leg is something that we say in Portuguese. So sometimes if you can get too overwhelmed, this can be detrimental to your development. It's very important to do things step by step, you know. And it's very easy to get overwhelmed with the solvers and try to implement all stuff at once. I think someone said this in the beginning of the coaching. So I think it's important to be self-aware, and it's important to understand where EV comes from, which is from mistakes, whether you can reduce yours or increase of the your opponents. You can generate EV by doing both things. Right, so to answer the question about the 8x combos, well, for sure they're not going to be pure calls, right? Especially the ones without a draw. There's just going to be a pure bluff catcher against a polarized range. So we're going to have to fold a lot of it over 8x. We also have a bunch of other stronger hands that we're going to continue, such as ace-x plus and even some 9x and pair plus draw type hands. So I think a lot of the 8x that don't have a redraw are just going to fold. Okay, so let's take a look against the bigger raise. Yeah, so just pure folding and just calling with the redraw. So just calling with the 7 and just calling with the 6. Okay, so if you have the pair and the gutter, you call. If you don't, you just fold. Pretty straightforward. What else someone said here that I wanted to address? Yeah, so a third card where we don't use blocking bets. All right, so who can give me an example of a turn card and no cheating? Just try to think about it. Don't look at the sim. Which turn card do you guys think that we should never have block bets? All right, let's see. Alex said a 5. An ace. Well, we're just seeing ace, and we have a lot on the ace here. So ace, definitely not the answer. A 6. I would think I'll use block bets, to be honest, said Charlie. Could be the case. Could be the case. If there are parts of the range that benefit from it and we can't get exploited by doing it, then it should happen. Who else? Who else wants to take a stab here? No one else? Come on, guys. So ace is out of the question. We're just seeing the ace. Let's think about the 5. I agree with Charlie. Heart. Deuce, rainbow. Said, I agree with Charlie, but I'll try the turn 9. Frank said, diamond. Diamond is interesting. Diamond is interesting. Unimproved range cards for OOP. Like which ones, Lewis? Come on, give me one example. So a lot of different estimates here. So I'm going to say heart is for sure wrong. Okay, so we definitely need to have some blocking bets on a heart. So imagine you play a strategy where you only bet big or check on a heart. Okay, so you're going to check 90% of your range, and checking 90% of your range out of position, this is something that is not very good for the EV of a range. Okay, especially in a spot where you do have flushes. You do have flushes, you have sets. So heart, we're definitely going to have blocks on a heart. On a 5, I would assume we're also going to need to have some blocks on a 5. Okay, we do have 5x in our range. So remember, we are going to open pre-flop with a hand like ace 5 off. We're going to have a bunch of 5-6 suited, maybe 7-5, all of the king 5, queen 5, jack 5. So we do have 5x in our range, and we are going to be able to bet some middling strength hands. And what else? 10 of hearts, 6 of hearts, no. Oh, it's a brick, right? Like a deuce. 6 or a 7. We're also going to need to have blocks on a 6 or a 7, right? Because again, imagine a strategy where you only polarize on a fortress straight board, where villain probably has a slight advantage on straights. You just don't get to realize your equity, basically. So we're going to have to play depolarize on those cards. And yeah, I think the cards that come closest to probably not allowing this are going to be the diamonds. Because on the diamonds, two things are going to happen. Your fold equity is going to be decreased as even more hands for IP are going to have equity. And a lot of your very strong hands are going to want to size up. So imagine a deuce of diamonds. Yes, on a deuce of diamonds, I think it could still have some blocks, but a lot of your strong hands are going to want to size up. And when your strong hands want to size up, then you can't have strong hands anymore to balance the block bet size to allow you to have the block bet range. Okay, so I think what comes closest, David said, Saul is bluffing as we only have blocks or check. I think that could happen. I think maybe all runouts have blocks, but I think the ones that come the closest to not having should be the blank diamonds. Okay, so let's check that out. Let's take a look at the deuce of diamonds. I think is the one that, in my view, should probably contain the least. And if we're wrong in that one, then no, yeah. So the deuce of diamonds specifically seems to be one in which it shouldn't have. And here, whenever you see these very low frequency strategic options on the solver, it's a good idea if you have sims, of course, it's a good idea to rerun a subtree from that point, because the amount of exploitability in the tree is going to be significant on the strategic options that seem to be fading away from the tree. Okay, so I think if we run this sim to very low exploitability, maybe this would even disappear. It seems to be exclusively being used by 7s and 6s, and yeah, those hands are not really going to be much better as a block. So I think it's definitely possible that we don't ever want to have the blocks on the deuce of diamonds. Okay, so congrats to Frank. Frank was the one that came closest, I think. He said diamond, to be honest.
OK，那今天咱们这个视频就先看到这儿，然后我把这个链接分享到那个聊天框里边来，然后大家需要的话可以下去再看一下，就是带字幕的版本嘛。如果说后面有视频需要去生成字幕的话，大家也可以用这种方式下载下来，上传到YouTube 去处理一下。然后下周的大师课，给大家请到的是一个在国内公开平台上面打25、50、100的一个牌手，就是因为前几个月的大师课都在讲 MTT 嘛，然后下个月的大师课准备给大家讲一下国内8max 的 anti-straddle 的盲注结构下的一些调整呀。就是可能咱们就所有学员里边应该还有一半或者多一半还是以打国内局为主的。然后下周的大师课希望大家能那个按时过来，具体的时间我们还是会在周4通知。OK， 那今天就先到这儿吧，拜拜。